Extension 720 with Milt Rosenberg on 720 WGN.
Viva la quinta brigata, rumba la rumba la rumba la. Viva la quinta brigata, rumba la rumba la rumba la. Che sta cubierta de gloria, ay Manuela, ay Manuela. Che sta cubierta de gloria, ay Manuela, ay Manuela.
Quinta Brigada, long live the 5th Brigade. The 5th Brigade was essentially composed of Americans fighting in the Spanish Civil War. And we play that as background, now fading, as we introduce Stanley G. Payne, who's been with us many times before, on the phone now from Madison, Wisconsin, where he is professor of history. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
It's a pleasure to have you with us again after rather a while, and it's been very fascinating and very instructive reading this new book of yours. Of course, you've written about the Spanish Civil War before, but this is a book in a new series apparently issued by Cambridge University Press, Short Histories of Wars.
Well, no, it's called Cambridge Essential Histories. It deals with wars and other things as well.
Yeah.
Major themes in modern history.
Let us focus directly in on the Spanish Civil War. I learned from your first chapter that, in fact, it's the most outstanding, but by no means the only civil war fought in Europe during the 1930s.
Well, in the 1930s, it was the only civil war, but not the only civil war of the whole era, from World War I to World War II. There were obviously a series of civil wars during and after World War I, and then two at the end of World War II, especially the main ones in Yugoslavia and Greece. What was unique about the Spanish War was the only civil war during the main interwar period, and so therefore it attracted more attention even than the Russian Civil War after the Russian Revolution.
And just like the American Revolution, there were other foreign forces involved. In this case, foreign forces from the three major dictatorships of the European continent.
Exactly. And therefore, both sides on the Spanish War developed the same kind of discourse for themselves, saying that they were being invaded by one or more foreign powers. That is, on the side of the nationalists, the right-wing forces of General Franco, Italy and Germany began to intervene after only 1 week, and then later on the Soviets on the other side of the left-wing Republicans against Franco. And Franco's people said that they were being invaded by a communist revolution from the Soviet Union. The Republicans said that they were being invaded by the fascist forces from outside. And both sides of the Spanish Civil War took the position they were fighting a kind of national liberation war against foreign liberation.
Is this a war that one can trace, as one could say World War II, to the very strong influence of certain particular eccentric but powerful personalities? You can't quite imagine World War II if Hitler had been somehow shot down in World War I when he was a soldier at the front.
I don't think we can do the same sort of thing in the case of the Spanish War, because there was a lot of confusion and blundering, and the man who became the dominant personality who won the war, General Franco, wanted to stay out of this sort of thing until the very last minute. So it was kind of the other way around, whereas in World War II you have major personalities like Hitler and Stalin who are directing the forces in a very willful way from the very beginning. In the Spanish War you have a lot of confusion and indirection until the major confrontation breaks out.
So is it then really a war that had about it something of the smack of inevitability? Or there are social forces that can be named which inevitably converged to produce finally in 1936 that war?
Well, all of the European civil wars in the first half of the 20th century were revolutionary civil wars. That is, they developed as a result of the outbreak of revolutionary forces and the resistance against them by the counter-revolutionaries. The Second Republic in Spain was first a democratic reform process that gave way then to a revolutionary process led by the major revolutionary movements of Spain. The curious thing about Spain was, of course, that the two major revolutionary movements were not communist. One was anarchist and the other was socialist. The communists at first were sort of the weak sister of the other two, but basically the confrontation was revolutionary and counter-revolutionary. And the $64 question here, and one that can never be answered, is whether there was really any chance of managing the revolutionary process without having it come to full blows in a major civil war. That was the way it worked out in the long run, but many historians have taken the position, of course, that this could have been managed. It's hard to see because the socialists had the notion that basically it was better to provoke the army and get it all over with because the left was fairly sure that they could win a short civil war. The military insurrectionists who actually began the fighting by rebelling against the left-wing government, I think were less confident, but they figured that they had better give it a chance before it was too late.
Who were the anarchists? What, in fact, was the ideological substance of Spanish anarchismo?
Well, it came from the doctrines that you find are actually begun by different Russians that nowadays people don't even remember. 19th century Russian revolutionaries who were very anti-Marxist. That is, first Mikhail Bakunin and then Pyotr Kropotkin, who developed theories of libertarian communism, as they called it, an individualist form of revolutionism that would not be aimed at reconstructing the state and creating a strong revolutionary state like the Marxists, later the communists, but in fact would create a kind of libertarian society, though by means of violence and the most extreme revolutionary kind of action.
It's curious. They were expected they could do a great leap forward to the end state of history, because Marx himself says that the ultimate end state of history, after a successful building of communism, is the, quote, the withering away of the state.
That's right. And from the anarchist point of view, the Marxists were in fact a retrogression, a step backward, because they were just simply, under the guise of revolution, recreating in a worse form the worst aspects of the old system and not getting at the end goal. The anarchists thought they were going to arrive there, as you say, very rapidly. And in most European countries, the anarchist doctrine seemed simply too radical, too simplistic, and got major support only to some extent in Russia, who had lost out to the communists there, but particularly in Spain, and in Spain it became a mass movement.
I learned from this very riveting new book of yours, The Spanish Civil War, by Stanley G. Payne, just published by Cambridge University Press, that this was a war against civilians as well as against one's opponents on the battlefield.
That was the worst part of the war, because although the war militarily had some place in the record of military history because it began combined arms, air and ground operations, it was not much of a war overall, rather desultory war for the most part militarily. But the worst part of it were what the Spanish like to call nowadays the repression, that is, the mass atrocities of executions of civilians done by both sides during the first 6 or 8 months of the war.
They speak of both the Red Terror and the White Terror, don't they?
Right. And you have large numbers of people killed by both sides, and if you add them up, they come to almost as many people as the number of Spanish soldiers on both sides actually killed in the fighting. Not quite. It isn't too far apart. The difference is about 3 to 2 in terms of the superior numbers of the people fallen.
Well, what are the total casualties on both sides?
Well, the number of Spanish soldiers who were killed probably were not many more than about 150,000 in the fighting. To that, you have to add another 20 or 30,000 of foreign participants who were killed as well. But in terms of the executions, you have maybe put the two sides together, you have possibly as many as 120,000 people killed in political executions. And this was not the end of it, because then once Franco had won, though he had moderated things after the first 8 months during the Civil War, as had the other side, he took the position at the end that now that the other side had committed so many crimes, everything had to be punished. So he carried out a long series of military court-martials and executed another 28,000 people after the war was over.
Yeah. Rather quite dreadful. It's interesting, of course, to note, we're about to pause for some commercials, and I want to talk then a bit about this, that there was American participation, as there was French participation, as there was German participation on both sides, official German forces on the nationalist side, but also German communists and anti-Nazis on the loyalist side, and many, many nations, England, etc., Scandinavian nations, sent men to fight in that war. What's the total size of the American contingent? Do you have any idea?
It was, the total number of American volunteers was probably about 2,800, a little under 3,000, in other words. Curiously, almost exactly the same number of Soviet participants on the other side, but the Soviets were all professional military men who were ordered by Stalin. The Americans were all individual volunteers who became of their own regard at the behest of the Communist International to fight for the Republic.
I've got an interview with four of them. One of them, I think, went on to become the head of the American Communist Party, Steve Nelson. Am I right in that?
I don't remember whether Steve became a head of the American Party or not. He certainly was an important leader.
He was a prominent member of the American Communist Party.
Yeah, right.
I've got about a 6-minute clip from an interview done with them back in the 1970s that I want you and all of our listeners to hear. All of that to follow after this.
This is Extension 720 with Milt Rosenberg on 720 WGN.
And we return to Stanley G. Payne, Professor of History, University of Wisconsin, and the author of the newly published book, The Spanish Civil War. If you have any interest at all in the Spanish Civil War, and it's a fascinating story, this is the book for you. It's concise and yet full of relevant detail and full of necessarily strong interpretation. One interpretation I certainly get from your book is that in terms of sheer material force and military force, it was all on the side of the nationalists, on the side of the fascists.
Well, it ended up that way, but there was an early and middle part of the war in which the relationships were rather different. The nationalists got early support from Hitler and Mussolini, which enabled them to become stronger, but just at that point Stalin came in on the other side, and you had a year of equilibrium, really, from the end of 1937 until about the autumn of the end of 1936 until the autumn of 1937, and then the balance really began to shift. And during the last year of the war, the Franco's army was clearly the superior force.
What is the Battle of Jarama, or Jarama?
Jarama is a river and a river valley just a little ways south of Madrid, and it was the site of one of a series of battles fought around the Spanish capital in the late autumn and the winter of 1936-37, with the attempt on the part of Franco to either first to seize the city directly, and when he couldn't do that, to try to outflank it first from the south and then from the north. The attempt to outflank it from the south went through the Jarama River Valley, and that's where the Republicans shifted down their forces in February 1937 and stopped the nationalists with very little advance in territory.
We've got lots of interesting music out of the Spanish Civil War, and here's one that may be known to some of our listeners. It's Jarama Valley. The song must have been written in Spain at the time of the battle or shortly thereafter, but sung here by Woody Guthrie. And it's to this clearly by an American, whoever first put it together, because it's to the melody of Red River Valley. Here it is.
It might be well to place the American and English-speaking brigade in relationship to what actually existed in Spain, because we were not the only internationals there. There were internationals that came from all over the world.
We've made a mistake. Somebody in the booth has made a mistake. That's something I do want to play later, and that is the conversation with 4 American veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. But what we're after now is number 3 on our other list. It's called Jarama Valley, and I'm sure we can find it very quickly and play it. Here, I trust it is.
There's a valley in Spain called Jarama. It's a place that we all know so well. It was there that we fought against the fascists. We saw a peaceful valley turn to hell. From this valley they say we are going, but don't hasten to bid us adieu. Even though we lost the battle at Harama, we'll set this valley free, for we're through. We were men of the Lincoln Battalion. We're proud of the fight that we made. We know that you people of the valley will remember our Lincoln Brigade. From this valley they say we are going, but don't hasten to bid us adieu. Even though we lost that battle at Harama, we will set this.
It's my impression that the Spanish Civil War and the participation in it of American communists, mostly they were, though not all of them were, representatives of the American Communist Party, remained, and perhaps even to this day still remains, somehow a nostalgic core of sentimentality for those who have inherited that tradition.
Oh, there's no question about that. And it was very important also in Eastern Europe later on, after 1945. Became part of the official ideology of the German Democratic Republic, the communist regime in East Germany.
Yeah. Because
here was a case where people who were not Soviets were fighting against people who could be identified, at least to some extent, as fascists. And that was during a time of general appeasement of Hitler, so that this became really a very unique experience.
What was the military generalship and the military strategy ultimately superior on the nationalist side? They, of course, had most of the generals, didn't they?
Well, they had most of the generals. Depending on the quality of the generals, that may not make too much difference. The more important thing was that the nationalist army was simply better organized and better commanded in the field by ordinary combat officers.
And better equipped.
And then eventually developed a preponderance of weaponry as well during the second half of the war, which gave it increasingly overwhelming superiority, although it didn't really become overwhelming until the last year of the war.
They also have a German Air Force essentially flying for them, don't they?
Yeah, although they had just as many Italians, and the Italians have never gotten as much publicity. The Condor Legion, the special German mini air corps of 90 combat planes, was significant because it was carrying out air-to-ground support operations by means of medium bombers and then even a few dive bombers. The Italians did the same kind of thing. The Germans had conceptualized the tactic, however, a little more clearly than the Italians had. The amount of Italian participation was actually greater than the amount of German participation. But the Condor Legion was a very skilled unit, and although it never had as many as 100 planes in operation at any one time, it was important. And, of course, it also had a kind of symbolic political significance as well.
Hitler, of course, expected, or certainly hoped for, a repayment of the debt by Franco. That is, ultimately, during World War II, he expected and called for Spanish participation as a nation allied to Germany, but Franco held off and never went into the war.
Well, that's correct, and the ironic thing about it was that the participation of the war virtually was, at the time that Hitler requested it, at the end of 1940, to involve virtually no Spanish fighting, because what he really wanted to do was to send a German unit across Spain to seize Gibraltar and close off the Mediterranean to the British, and make it possible, therefore, for the Axis to control all of North Africa and get control, ultimately, of the Suez Canal as well. He wasn't even asking Franco to provide significant military forces because he realized that Spain, after the Civil War, did not have military units capable of fighting at the level of the major armies in World War II. But Franco had his price, and Hitler would not meet his price, and so this never happened.
What was Franco's price?
Franco wanted three things. He was very, very categorical about it. He wanted a good deal of military assistance, a good deal of economic assistance, and he also wanted a territorial guarantee that Hitler would give to Spain essentially a large part of French Northwest Africa. All of Morocco, northwestern Algeria, French Equatorial Africa. So it was a fairly stiff price, and the sticking part of it in 1940 was that the peculiar terms on which Hitler had signed the armistice with defeated France made the remainder of France in the Vichy regime, Marshal Pétain, a kind of satellite, not quite a military ally, but a satellite of Germany, which was important economically, producing for the German economy, and importantly also for the time being as a kind of international equilibrium to hold the rear guard in parts of the colonial world while Hitler concentrated on Europe. And so he took the position that he simply could not afford to give Franco these things while the war was on, and asked Franco to trust him that he would do the right thing in taking care of Spain after the war was over. But Franco was not too big on blind trust, so it just didn't work.
Franco, of course, counts as a fascist, and he maintained a fascist order in Spain for many more years than Hitler maintained his fascist Nazi order in Germany. I think he probably even exceeded Mussolini in terms of years in power.
Oh, of course, by all means. But, of course, the reason why he was able to do that and maintain this kind of fascism was that Franco always operated a very attenuated kind of fascism. It was not radical, and it did not dominate his system, and he was able to ratchet it down whenever he wanted to. And he began the ratcheting down in the middle of the war, and especially in 1943 when Mussolini was overthrown. Then he saw that this sort of thing simply wasn't going to work, and so he began to move in a somewhat different direction. And it was the very weakness of the fascism of the Franco regime as a political force in Spain that enabled Franco to survive as long. That is, one was sort of dependent on the other.
We're about to pause for an update on the news. But before we do, I should mention, of course, that one of the great books on fascism itself, on the very nature of European fascism, is by Stanley G. Payne. And we talked about that book on an earlier occasion. Right now, to the WGN newsroom.
Extension 720 with Milt Rosenberg on 720 WGN.
I'm sure, Stanley, you recognize that as yet another song from the Spanish Civil War. A las Barricadas, one of the great marching songs, I gather.
Yep.
And we'll fade on that and return to some of the main themes developed in the fine new book by Stanley Payne, The Spanish Civil War. You know, one word that has not yet arisen, one term that has not yet arisen, but is crucial to an understanding of the Civil War, is the Catholic Church.
Absolutely, and one of the main features of the war in Spain, even more than of the revolution and civil war in Russia 20 years earlier, was the fact that the revolutionaries made the civil war a war on religion, that is, specifically a war on Catholicism. And this probably was the greatest weakness of their whole program, because it had the effect simply of solidifying the resistance of virtually the entire Catholic population against them, and was the greatest moral and cultural, ideological and spiritual benefit that Franco enjoyed.
What was the basis of that? What was the basis of their anti-Catholicism?
The idea at the root of it, and there made a lot of specific charges against the church and the clergy, a few of which were true and many of which were untrue, but the root of it really was that Spanish tradition, Spanish conservatism, was very strongly identified with Catholicism, and that the Catholic Church and the clergy were therefore the real spiritual directors of the old order. And that it depended on them in a special way in which it didn't depend on anybody else. And therefore, the clergy particularly were targets of the revolution in the first months of the Civil War. But the effect of that actually was to weaken the Republican revolutionaries. And if they had been able to take a different policy, actually they would have been better off in the course of the struggle.
Was the hand of the Vatican in any way visibly present in the Spanish Civil War?
The Vatican tried to stay out of it. The only thing that you could perhaps compare this with, in a certain sense, was the quasi-civil war in Mexico in the late 1920s of the Cristeros, as they were called, against the revolutionary Mexican government. And the Vatican did not support that and tried to stay out of it. You have to remember also that in the point where the Spanish War began, in 1936, the Vatican had 7 years earlier signed a concordat with Mussolini, and 3 years earlier signed a concordat with Hitler. And particularly in terms of the latter arrangement, the Vatican had begun to feel by that time that it had gotten its fingers very badly burned. And Pope Pius XI, who was in charge, was becoming more and more anti-Nazi by the month. And therefore, even though the Spanish church leaders urged the Vatican to support Franco, the Vatican was very chary of any kind of overt recognition of Franco, and did not send a nuncio. Did send a semi-official representative, but never sent an official nuncio to Spain during the war.
Now, here's something I wanted you to hear, and I wanted our audience to hear. This is a conversation done by Pacifica Radio rather a while ago in 1971 with 4 veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Battalion of the International Brigade. And one of them is, as I said, a man who became quite prominent in the American Communist Party later on, or was prominent even then, namely Steve Nelson. Also Robert Stack, Lawrence Kane, and Maury Colau are interviewed here in this excerpt from, as I say, 1971.
It might be well to place the American and English-speaking brigade in relationship to what actually existed in Spain, because we were not the only internationals there. There were internationals that came from all over the world. In actuality, in terms of its organizational formation, there were 5 international brigades. There was the 11th, which was essentially German-speaking Scandinavian people. There was the 12th, which was the Italian. They called it the Garibaldi Brigade. But it was essentially Italian-speaking people.
Anti-fascists.
Yeah, Italian-speaking anti-fascists. There was the 13th, which was known as the Dąbrowski, which was Polish, and mostly comprised of Central Europeans. Slavs of one kind or another. So there was a similarity of language and an ease of understanding each other. There was the 14th, which was the French and the Belgian, called the Franco-Belge. And there was the 15th International Brigade, which essentially...
15th was the Anglo-American.
Anglo-American. Englishmen, Canadians, and so on. Australians, New Zealanders, and also a battalion in there of Latin Americans.
Oh, yeah. It might be worth a while mentioning now where we fit into the whole picture of the Spanish fight. You see, the fascists had an organized army, and the loyalist side had nothing but civilians who were armed. You know what I mean? We were exactly like they were. We were armed civilians, volunteers, without necessarily a lot of military training. The loyalist government, it took it some time for it to introduce a draft, because there were those who were opposed to the draft on principle. So the reason we were shunted around at the beginning, the point Maury was making, is because the other side was putting on the pressure. They had the army, they had, needless to say, out of a whole army in the country, they had some 800 generals in the country. They all went with the fascists except 4.
Tanks.
4 remained on the loyalist
Air
side.
Force, they had the whole business.
Then they had the Air Force, then they had 50,000 Germans, 100,000 Italians, and 25,000 Portuguese from the very start.
And God knows how many Moors.
From the very start. And they had the colonial Spanish army under Franco, which was the Moors and Foreign Legion that were brought in. So our purpose for going there, we might make that point too, was not so much military, although that was important. It was to show the Spanish people that there are people in the world who are with them.
Although the truth of the matter is that the military situation was so bad that the brigade was thrown into every major battle in Spain, and as shock troops, And they were inspirational, as Steve has pointed out. But, I participated in World War II when I was in the Navy, drafted into the Navy. And there were a lot of guys on my ship, and they certainly did a good job. I don't want to denigrate them. But a lot of them just didn't give a damn. They just wanted to get the hell out as soon as they could. But every guy who was in Spain, despite his momentary physical, personal fear or anything that he experienced, nevertheless had enough of an ideology, enough of a feeling that kept him alive and kept him going and made him a fantastic soldier in a sense.
I wanted to ask...
There we have a portion of that conversation. How accurate are these guys in their memories?
Well, it begins with remarks, I guess, of Steve Nelson describing the organization of the IBs, and that first minute or two was completely accurate about the 5 main brigades. Interestingly, as he pointed out quite correctly, numbered 11 through 15. That was done for propaganda purposes to make it sound as though there were 15, but in fact there were only 5 full brigades most of the time.
Yeah.
And then after that they wander off much more into propaganda. They didn't have to fight the whole Spanish army. The Spanish army divided in half, but the revolutionaries were very reluctant to use the other half of the army, and they mostly dissolved it and tried to fight with the revolutionary militia. And that didn't work, and then they began to reorganize the new People's Army. The veterans are correct that the people in the IBs are volunteers. The Comintern organized people from all over Europe and North America, not so much from other parts of the world, but there were a few Latin Americans as well.
There clearly was a lot of infighting within the Loyalist forces. George Orwell tells the story in one of his books, who was there as a volunteer also, of his being incarcerated, I guess, by the anarchists who were planning to execute him.
Yes, George Orwell was a volunteer, but not for the international brigades. He was an independent revolutionary who fought for the militia of the Independent Communist Party of Spain, which was sometimes allied with the anarchists, actually. So that there were many different sorts of such people. The anarchists also organized small international unit of their own, but not at all of the size of Comintern. The main Comintern international brigades numbered altogether during the course of the war about 41,000 people, though probably not very many more than 20,000 appeared on the fighting line at any one time.
It's time for us to pause for a last round of commercials, but first I do, of course, want to invite telephone calls, and the lines are open once again. The number is, of course, 312-981-7200, 312-981-7200. For that matter, if you want to get to us via email, the email address, extension 720 at wgnradio.com. And we welcome your calls and or emails. You have to get them in quickly. We'll be directly back to Stanley Payne and hopefully on to some of your contributions as well after we pause for these words.
Extension 720 with Milt Rosenberg on 720 WGN.
The Spanish Civil War by Stanley G. Payne is a book easily to be recommended to any who've got any interest at all in modern history and in the last throes of, well, not the last throes, but the early throes of fascism, that having been a fascist revolution against what is essentially a left-wing and quasi-Marxist revolution. It's pretty hard to specify all the players in this game, Stanley, isn't it? There were so many, particularly on the Loyalist side, who disagreed in some significant ways with one another and between the various Loyalist factions.
That was their major problem, and in fact the major Republican leaders admitted after the war was over that their greatest deficiency was not really military so much as their internal disunity and the lack of decisive and unified leadership.
Here's an email from one of our listeners who says, at least one historian, Frederick L. Schumann, says that FDR and his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, quietly wanted Franco to win. So they saw to it that quite a lot of arms and planes and military equipment were shipped to neutral Portugal, knowing that these would find their way over the border and into Franco's Spain. The name of the Portuguese dictator at the time was Salazar, who was a friend of Franco's. Is that a reasonable interpretation?
No. The only part of that that's correct is the last phrase, that Salazar was a friend of Franco. The rest of it is all completely wrong. Roosevelt tried to be neutral during the first year of the Civil War. And during the second half of the Civil War, he veered more and more toward the Republican side. But by that time, the Congress had passed neutrality legislation that even applied to civil wars as well, so nothing could be done. One American historian has found that in the last year of the Civil War, Roosevelt even tried to organize, through a third party, a scheme to sell American warplanes by independent manufacturers to the Mexican government to ship to the Republic. But that simply couldn't be done, as it turned out, because of the strictness of the neutrality legislation. But the main part of that message is totally mistaken.
Wasn't there a fair amount of public support by significant American public figures also for the Loyalist cause? I think Hollywood was sort of on the side of the Loyalists, was it not?
Yeah, well, the Comintern worked on that very hard. And they got a lot of Hollywood support, but quite aside from the Comintern, the fact was that particularly by the second half of the Civil War, American public opinion was very clearly about 2-1 on the side of the Republicans. But at the same time, the same people who favored the Republicans said that they didn't want the United States to become involved in any way. So that was just a kind of sentiment, but it had no implications with regard to policy.
Here is a call from one of our listeners. Mark joins us. Good evening.
Good evening, Milton. I'm presuming that the fascist forces, to one degree or another, were anti-Semitic. But since you mentioned George Orwell in there, and I remember he was in that, he was rather an anti-Semite himself.
Well, that went with the territory of being a British intellectual at the time.
I guess. So was this rather on both sides? Or?
Well, how much overt anti-Semitism did the nationalists display?
Well, in terms of policy, none.
I wouldn't have thought so.
It was part of the rhetoric to say part of this, use phrases like Jewish and communist conspiracy. But it didn't go beyond rhetoric. Franco was not particularly anti-Semitic. And in Spanish Morocco particularly, there were Spanish citizens, and the Jewish boys were drafted into the Nationalist Army of Franco and treated like everybody else.
Are there Jewish figures?
One occasion when a kind of propaganda incident developed in Spanish Morocco, and Franco intervened personally to say, we're not going to have this sort of thing. Everybody must be united behind the war effort, and we're not going to engage in vendettas against Jews. Franco was not really an anti-Semite. He had his own fixations, but Jews were not one of them.
So, in other words, sir, anything that Franco might have said might have just been for the benefit of Hitler and the Nazis.
Well, no, that's not quite right either, because this was part of the standard rhetoric of the right to throw in the adjective Jewish, even though at that time there were only 6,000 Jews in Spain, and they weren't even talking about the Jews in Spain, but the idea that there was a Jewish big business or international finance, that sort of thing. But it was strictly rhetorical.
But rabid anti-Semitism was clearly the specialty of the German Nazis. It's worth remembering, am I right on this, Stanley, that there was at least one Jewish member of the fascist Grand Council in Italy at the beginning of the war?
The Italian fascist movement originally had been disproportionately Jewish.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is that the proportion of Jews in the movement was actually slightly greater than that of the very tiny proportion of Jews in the Italian population as a whole. That all changed in 1938. But the Germans in Spain were rather scandalized to see that Franco had no regulations of any kind controlling or restricting Jews. He just did not see this as a problem. And there were very few Jews in Spain anyway.
We go to another caller. Troy joins us. Good evening, Troy. You're on the air.
Yeah, so I just, I read in some other books, how they compared the Bosnian War with all these ideologies, people from all over, you had the Catholics helping the Croats and the Orthodox Serbs and, of course, the Muslims, and how these two wars compare, and why is it that Europeans, whenever there's like a civil war, people from other countries get involved?
Well, they don't necessarily always get involved for some time. It depends. European countries, of course, are cheek by jowl by each other, and the intervention in the Russian Civil War, by and large, was not that great militarily, and didn't play much role in the Finnish Civil War either. In Spain, it certainly did. In Yugoslavia, of course, because of the World War going on, there wasn't much foreign intervention. Eventually, though, in Greece it became important because the British and American governments helped the Greek anti-communists win the Greek Civil War. So you do find a lot of it, one way or the other. That's certainly so.
You actually find a lot of participation in the Greek War of Independence against Turkey way back in the middle of the 19th century.
That's right.
Lord Byron was on his way to Greece when he died, I think.
That is absolutely correct.
And
Lord Byron. Then 100 years later, in the 1920s, you had the Greek-Turkish War. And the same things happens. Europeans just seem to battle each other, and even if their country's not involved, others will get involved.
Well, but it does reflect, does it not, Stanley, a great division in Western civilization, particularly in Europe, in the 30s, and then ultimately enacted during World War II, namely a division between what essentially has to be called liberalism or democracy, and essentially a traditionalist orientation, which at its worst took a fascist turn, but also was strongly anchored in the Catholic Church and was very worried about and angry at the possibility of, and very threatened by the possibility of communist domination.
Yeah, and the lineup tends to change decade by decade.
Yeah.
After World War I, it tended to be revolutionary versus counter-revolutionary, but then comes the development of fascism, and that triangulates the whole thing. And ultimately it becomes fascist and anti-fascist, even though the anti-fascists, as in Spain, differed very widely. During World War II, they differed more widely yet, but at least in Europe they cooperated against Hitler. And then, of course, after that was over with, the revolutionaries versus counter-revolutionaries, or communists and anti-communists took over again following 1945. But the lineup changes somewhat from decade to decade.
One more quick call coming up, and this is Joe, who joins us. Good evening, Joe. You're on the air.
Yes, this isn't exactly the same subject, but of course it's Spain. How did Colonel Leon de Grelle manage to live in Spain for so long?
Because he was not a German, but a Waffen-SS non-German. And
yes, he was.
He was not on the list of Germans originally the Allies asked for. Franco didn't give them all up anyway. He sent ordinary German personnel back, but there were several hundred Germans who managed to stay in Spain.
We should make clear who
de Grelle simply took advantage of that.
We should make clear who de Grelle was.
Leon de Grelle was the leader of a Wallon or Belgian fascist party in the late 1930s,
yes,
who rallied to Hitler, whereas in the Low Countries some of the fascists did not, but opposed the Germans as foreign imperialists. But he became very pro-Nazi and was a distinguished veteran officer of the Waffen-SS, wounded, I think, 6 times. Hitler loved him, and he managed to escape in 1945 by getting a very small airplane with a pilot that managed to fly to the northern coast of Spain, run out of fuel, and crash land virtually on the beach. It was an extraordinary story.
We are very close to the end of the available time. I can't resist asking something that has fascinated me. You're an expert on fascism as well. We've talked about the rise of fascism in Europe, and you've done a major book on that. What do you know about the case of a former professor at the University of Chicago, Mircea Eliade?
Oh, Eliade was one of the active young intellectuals of the Romanian fascist movement, which is sometimes called the Iron Guard. But that was the dominant political influence among the young intelligentsia in Romania in the 1930s. You have a whole series of noted Romanian intellectuals, like Emil Cioran, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, who had been an Iron Guardist. So that was kind of par for the course in Romania around 1935.
What discovery did you make doing the research for this new book, The Spanish Civil War, that had escaped you in your previous scholarly pursuits?
Well, I've been working on this sometimes, so this is kind of a summation. And I guess what was most interesting actually was to look on, not so much on the political side, but on the military side, and see how the balance of military forces shifted over the course of the war.
And that's
nothing remarkably dramatic about that.
But that's very clearly represented in the book. It's a fine book. I've very much enjoyed reading it. And I thank you so much for joining us tonight, Stanley.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And we will be back again on Sunday night, I do believe. Until then, it's worth repeating that the new book by Stanley Payne is titled The Spanish Civil War and is published by Cambridge University Press. This program, like all of our programs, will be up on the podcast file, which you can get to that'll be by late tomorrow, surely. You get to that set of podcasts by going to wgnradio.com/extension 720. With that, thanks to all for listening, and a most cordial good night.